The morning the locks were changed, I stood on the front porch of the house I had lived in for 9 years, holding a single cardboard box. Inside it, a photo album, a winter coat, my mother's old Bible. That was all I had taken on my way out. Not because I didn't want more, but because every other thing in that house had already been legally transferred out of my name. The deed, gone. The joint account, drained. The car I drove to work every single morning, repossessed by noon. I stood there on that porch and I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at that box in my arms and I thought, so this is what the end looks like. Quiet, ordinary, like a Tuesday. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you stopped paying attention? Stopped reading the paperwork? Stopped asking questions? Because you just believed that what was yours was safe? If you have, I need you to stay with me through this entire story. Because what happened next, what I found, what I discovered, what I did with it, I don't think you'll see it coming. Drop a comment below and tell me, I'm staying. I read every single one. Let me take you back. About 3 years before that Tuesday on the porch, Marcus and I had been together for 11 years, married for 7. We met in our late 20s, both working long hours, both ambitious, both convinced that if we just built something together, we'd be untouchable. He was charming in the way that disarms you slowly, not flashy, not loud. He was the kind of man who remembered how you liked your coffee, who showed up when you were sick, who made you feel like the most sensible thing you'd ever done was choose him. We bought the house in the 2nd year of our marriage, a 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood, nothing grand, but it was ours. We painted the kitchen ourselves on a rainy Saturday and ordered pizza because neither of us had cleaned the brushes yet, and the smell of paint was still everywhere. Then I remember thinking, this is the beginning of something that lasts. But there were signs, small ones. Signs I explained away because explaining them away was easier than looking at them directly. He started handling all the finances. You're so busy at work, let me deal with it. That sounded like love. He took over the mortgage payments. I've got a good system, don't worry. That sounded like partnership. He had me sign a document one evening after dinner, something about refinancing, a better interest rate. I didn't read it carefully. Why would I? I trusted him. I now know I should have read every single word. The unraveling didn't happen overnight. That's the part no one tells you about betrayal. It tends to arrive slowly, dressed up like completely normal life. The first thing that shifted was access. I tried to log into our joint bank account one morning to check a transaction and my credentials didn't work. Marcus said the bank had done a system update and he'd sort it. He sorted it by opening a new account in his name only. And slowly our joint one went quiet. Then there was the car. He'd suggested we trade in mine for something newer, more reliable, he said. Practical. He handled the paperwork. I signed where he pointed. What I didn't realize was the new car went into his name alone. A practical decision, he called it. Insurance reasons. I didn't push back. I had my name on the house, I reasoned. The big things were secure. Yes, they were not. Over 18 months, piece by piece, quietly and methodically, Marcus had moved assets. He'd consulted a lawyer, not ours, his own. He'd done his research. He knew exactly which levers to pull and in which order. And I was working 60-hour weeks, trusting the man I had chosen, living inside an arrangement that was quietly being disassembled around me. The divorce petition arrived on a Wednesday. I almost didn't open it at the door. I thought it was a utility bill. I sat down at the kitchen table with it. Our kitchen table. The one we'd argued over in the furniture store because I wanted round and he wanted rectangular, and we'd compromised on a rectangular one with rounded corners. By the time I got to page 4, my coffee had gone cold. He wasn't just filing for divorce. He had structured it so that based on the paperwork trail, the transfers, the signatures, the account history, the house was already effectively in his name. The car was his. The savings account that bore both our names had been dormant so long that my legal claim to it had been administratively transferred. The legal language was dense and deliberate. This had been planned. My lawyer, when I finally, frantically got one, looked at me across the desk with an expression I'll never forget. Measured. Careful. Not unkind, but honest. "You signed a lot of things," she said. "I trusted him," I said. She nodded like she'd heard that before. "I know. Let's see what we can work with." What we could work with was not much. The legal costs alone ate the small amount in my personal checking account. By the time the proceedings concluded, what had been ours was his, confirmed and finalized. I walked out of that courtroom on a gray afternoon with my coat and my bag and the knowledge that I had nowhere to sleep that night that felt like home. My sister offered her couch. I stayed for 2 weeks before the guilt of disrupting her family became unbearable. A colleague mentioned a room for rent, a converted garage with a single window that faced a concrete wall. I took it. It was available immediately, and available immediately was all that mattered. The garage was cold in the mornings, the kind of cold that gets into your joints before you're fully awake. The space heater I bought from the discount store rattled when it ran too hard, so I learned to run it on medium and wear an extra sweater instead. I didn't tell many people what had happened. Not in detail. I gave people the shorthand version. Divorce, it was complicated, I'm fine, because the full version required energy I no longer had. The nights were the hardest. And not because I missed Marcus. I'd stopped missing him once I understood what he'd done. I missed the version of my life that had felt stable. The version where I was not lying awake in a converted garage wondering how I had arrived here. Some nights I'd sit up with my mother's Bible on my lap. Not reading it, just holding it. I'd lost both my parents by then. Dad had passed 6 years earlier. Mom followed 3 years after that. The grief had settled into something manageable by now. Not gone, but quiet. The kind of loss you've learned to carry. The Bible was worn at the spine. My mother had underlined passages in pencil, written small notes in the margins in her tidy handwriting. I'd look at those notes sometimes and feel, for just a moment, less alone. I didn't know yet that she had left me more than the Bible. About a month into the garage situation, I received a letter. It came from a law firm I didn't recognize, addressed to me formally, my full legal name, which was unusual because most people used my nickname. The return address was in a small town about 2 hours from where I grew up. The letter informed me that as the surviving beneficiary of my mother's estate, I was entitled to a parcel of land in that county. It had been held in a trust she had established before her passing. There were steps I needed to take to formally claim it. I almost threw it away. Not because I didn't care, but because I was exhausted. And because the idea of driving 2 hours to deal with paperwork about a plot of land I'd never heard of felt, in that moment, like more than I could manage. When I mentioned it to my sister, she shrugged. Didn't Mom grow up out there somewhere? Probably just some old overgrown field. Could be more hassle than it's worth. That's exactly what I thought. An old overgrown field. Inherited trouble. More paperwork, more fees, more of my time swallowed by processes I didn't have the bandwidth for. I put the letter in the cardboard box with the photo album and the Bible. And I tried to forget about it. 2 months passed. Then 3. I kept going to work. I kept eating. I started sleeping better once I got blackout curtains for the garage window. There's something almost meditative about rebuilding very slowly when you have no other choice. You stop thinking about the big picture because the big picture is too painful, and you start thinking only about the next small thing. The next small thing was making the garage feel less like a garage. I found a second-hand rug at a thrift shop, dark green, slightly worn at one edge, and it changed the entire feel of the space. I bought a plant, then another one. I started cooking actual meals instead of eating crackers over the sink. I reorganized the cardboard box, took out the photo album and actually looked through it, something I'd been avoiding, page by page. My parents on their wedding day. My mother laughing at something off camera, her hand blurred because she was mid-gesture. My father, younger than I ever really knew him, holding me as an infant with an expression of absolute terrified wonder. I cried. Finally, properly cried. Not about Marcus, not about the house, about them. When I put the album down, the letter from the law firm slipped out from between the back pages where I'd tucked it. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I picked up my phone. The attorney who answered, a man named Gerald, calm and methodical, told me the trust had been established 15 years ago. 15 years. My mother had set this up while she was still healthy, long before her diagnosis, long before any of us knew what was coming. Did she ever mention it to you? Gerald asked. No, I said. Never. There was a pause. She specifically requested that the trust not be disclosed to you until after the estate had fully settled, he said. She wanted there to be no interference with the process. Something about that phrasing sat strangely with me. Interference with the process. What process? Can you tell me what the land is? I asked. Like, what is it actually? My sister said it might just be an old field. Another pause, shorter this time. Ms. Harper, I think it would be worth your time to come see it in person, he said. I don't want to give you incomplete information over the phone. I hung up and sat very still in my green rugged garage with the 2 plants on the windowsill. Something felt different. I didn't know what yet, but something had shifted, like pressure changing before a storm. I drove out on a Saturday morning. The town was small, the kind where the gas station doubles as a diner and everyone seems to recognize each other's cars. Gerald's office was above a hardware store, accessible by a narrow staircase that creaked on the 3rd step. He was older than I'd imagined. White-haired, reading glasses on a beaded chain. His desk was covered in the organized chaos of a man who had worked in the same office for 30 years and had his own system. He shook my hand, gestured to a chair, and slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a deed and a letter, handwritten, in my mother's handwriting. I recognized it immediately, the same tidy script from the Bible margins, the same slightly slanted capital letters. I looked up at Gerald. She wrote this about 4 years before she passed, he said quietly. She asked me to give it to you when the time came. I'll give you some privacy. He left the room. I unfolded the letter. My darling, it began. I don't know when you'll read this or what your life will look like when you do. I hope it's a good day. I hope you're sitting somewhere warm. But I also know you, and I know the women in our family. We tend to get this letter on a hard day. So if that's where you are, I want you to know, I thought of you. I planned for you. And what I'm leaving you was always meant to be the foundation. There are things about the land that you don't know yet. Gerald will tell you everything. But first, I want you to know why I kept it from you. Because what you don't know, you cannot accidentally let someone else take from you. I had to stop reading for a moment. I had to breathe. I finished the letter in that office above the hardware store, and by the time I folded it back up, I understood some things and not yet others. I understood that my mother had been deliberate. She had structured this trust not out of secrecy for secrecy's sake, but out of protection. She had seen, or suspected, that the women in our family had a habit of loving people who required them to sign things. She had not been wrong. I understood that the land was more than a field. What I did not yet fully understand was how much more. Gerald walked me through the outline that afternoon, the acreage, the location, the zoning history, and I sat there taking notes in my phone with a strange buzzing sensation in my hands. The way your body responds when it's processing something your mind hasn't caught up with yet. I'll need to do some research before I can give you accurate figures, Gerald said carefully. Development interest in this area has changed significantly in the last several years. I didn't want to say anything until you could be here. Changed how? I asked. He looked at me over his reading glasses. Significantly, he said again. And this time the word carried weight. I drove back to the garage that evening with my mother's letter on the passenger seat and the radio off. Just the sound of the road. Something big was coming. I could feel the shape of it before I could see it. The next 3 weeks were the most purposeful I'd felt in years. I took a day off work and went back to that county. I walked the land with Gerald, all of it, properly, boots in the mud, wind coming sideways off the low hills. It was beautiful in an unpretentious way, rolling, green, quiet, and adjacent to a commercial corridor that had been expanding steadily southward for the past 8 years. I didn't say anything on that walk. I just looked and listened and let Gerald talk. Then I got a second opinion. I found an independent land appraiser, paid for the consultation myself, which stung, but I needed a number I could trust. I told no one what I was doing. Not my sister, not my colleagues, no one. The appraiser spent 2 days on it. When he called me with his initial findings, I was in the break room at work, eating a sandwich. I set the sandwich down. I asked him to repeat the number. He did. I said, "Thank you," very calmly, ended the call, and sat in the break room for 4 more minutes without moving. Then I went back to my desk and finished my afternoon like a normal person. Because something my mother had written in that letter had stayed with me. What you don't know, you cannot accidentally let someone else take from you. The inverse was also true. What you know, and no one else does, is yours to use exactly when and how you choose. My mother had grown up in that county. She'd left at 19 to move to the city, but her own mother, my grandmother, who I knew only from photographs and stories, had owned land there since the 1960s. When my grandmother passed, she left it to my mother in a handshake arrangement. No formal documentation, which was common then, especially in rural communities and especially for women who weren't expected to need legal language to protect what was theirs. My mother had spent years quietly formalizing that claim. She'd done it without telling my father, without telling us children, without telling anyone who didn't need to know. She hired Gerald sometime in her 50s, when she was healthy and thinking clearly about the future. She had the land surveyed, the title cleaned up, saw the deed transferred properly into a trust with me as the sole beneficiary. And then she waited. The land, 43 acres of it, sat for decades in a county that no one was paying much attention to, until a regional logistics company decided to expand their distribution network, until a new highway interchange was approved 2 miles north, until what had once been quiet farmland adjacent to nothing in particular became, slowly, and then suddenly, adjacently crucial. The land had been informally appraised before at low agricultural value, a few $1,000s at most. My sister hadn't been wrong about that. She just hadn't known what she didn't know. What the independent appraiser told me, based on comparable sales in the corridor and 2 preliminary inquiries he was already aware of, was that the land as it stood, undeveloped, unimproved, simply existing, carried a current market value somewhere between $2.1 and $2.6 million. And that number would likely increase if I waited. My mother had left me a foundation. She had just been very patient about handing it over. I told no one. Not my sister, not my lawyer, not my one close friend who knew most of the details of the divorce. Not a single person in my life knew what I had learned. I went back to the garage. I watered my plants. I went to work. But internally, everything had reorganized. I started learning. I read about land transactions, about development timelines, about how logistics companies negotiate land acquisition. I talked to Gerald twice a week. I had a long conversation with a commercial real estate attorney he recommended. I watched people around me, colleagues, acquaintances, my ex-husband's social circle, which I was still loosely aware of through mutual connections, and I noticed something interesting about power. The people who had it rarely announced it. They moved quietly. They made decisions without seeking approval. They let others fill the silence with assumptions, and they let those assumptions stand undisturbed. I could do that. I had been doing the opposite my entire adult life, explaining, justifying, making myself legible to people who had not earned that access. For the first time in years, I stopped. I simply watched and waited and gathered information. Marcus reached out in month 5. Not a formal communication, just a message. Casual, as if no time had passed. He'd heard through someone that I wasn't doing great. He wanted me to know there were no hard feelings, that he hoped I was okay. The message was warm in the way that things are warm when they want something. I read it once and set my phone face down. His sister called my sister a week later, something about a property question, looking for a document, wondering if I might have anything left in storage. The framing was friendly and confused, but the ask was clear. They were doing an inventory, checking what they might have missed. They assumed I was still the woman from the porch with a cardboard box. They were not wrong about where I had been. They were entirely wrong about where I was going. I did not respond to Marcus. I did not call his sister back. I let my silence do the work that words would have undermined. Then there was an inquiry through Gerald, not from Marcus directly, but from a name I didn't recognize, a representative of a company, asking in polite and formal language whether the parcel in question had an owner who might be open to a conversation about acquisition. They had found the land. They just didn't know who owned it yet. "Don't respond yet," I told Gerald. "For how long?" he asked. "Until I tell you to." Marcus called me directly in month 7. I answered. I had decided I would, when it happened. I wanted to hear what he said. His voice was the same. That was the strangest part. People don't change their voices. He was casual, warm, reasonable sounding. He'd heard I'd come into something. He didn't say how he'd heard, and I didn't ask. And he wanted to reach out personally. Reconnect, maybe. See how I was doing. He used the word unfair about the divorce, said there were things he regretted. I let him talk. When he stopped, I said, "I appreciate you calling." There was a pause. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss?" I asked. He fumbled slightly, said he just wanted to make sure I was okay, said he'd always cared about me. "I'm okay," I said. "Thank you." Another pause. "So there's nothing to... I have to go," I said. "Take care of yourself." And I ended the call. My hands were completely steady. I sat with that for a moment. The old version of me would have shaken, would have either cried or raged or tried to explain, would have needed the conversation to mean something. This version of me just pressed end and went to make tea. That was the last time we spoke. 2 companies made formal inquiries about the land within the following 3 months. Gerald fielded both of them. The first was the logistics company, regional, growing fast, eager. Their offer was substantial, more than enough to change my life completely. My lawyer looked at the terms and told me it was reasonable. I said, "Let's wait." She looked at me. "The second company," I said. "They haven't made their offer yet, and the interchange opens in 14 months. I'd like to see what this looks like then." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've done your research." "Yes," I said. "I have." There was also a third option my commercial real estate attorney had outlined, something my mother had not anticipated because the landscape had changed so much since she set up the trust. Rather than selling outright, I could lease a portion of the land on a long-term commercial basis and retain ownership. Revenue without loss of the asset. It was slower. It required more patience. But I was learning that patience was one of the few things that couldn't be signed away or refinanced or legally transferred without your knowledge. My mother had been patient for decades. I could be patient for 14 months. I'm not going to spend much time here because frankly, I don't think about it much. I know that Marcus's financial situation became complicated around the time a commercial development adjacent to a parcel he'd been eyeing for investment fell through. Something about the corridor development changing the surrounding land values in ways that disrupted his projections. I heard that secondhand and didn't investigate further. I know that the people who assumed my silence meant ignorance eventually stopped reaching out. I know that the woman who'd lent me her garage, a kind woman, a neighbor of my sister's, got a thank you gift from me that was probably more generous than she'd expected, because she had been decent to me at a moment when decency mattered. I'm not interested in aftermath as a form of triumph. What other people lost or suffered or regret is their accounting, not mine. What matters is what I built. I moved out of the garage 13 months after I moved in. I rented an apartment, a real one, with a second room I turned into an office, with windows that faced east so the morning light came in clean and direct. I put my mother's Bible on the desk in that office. Next to it, I framed one of her letters, not the one from Gerald's office, which I keep folded in a cedar box, but an older one she'd written me when I was 23 and going through something I've since mostly forgotten. The letter was short and practical and ended with, "You come from women who figured it out. Don't forget that." I'd forgotten. For a while, I'd thoroughly forgotten. I spent the first months in the apartment building a different kind of structure than I'd spent my 30s building. Not a house, not joint accounts. It's not a shared life with shared paperwork signed without reading. I built knowledge, relationships with people who knew things I didn't, a quiet financial foundation, corner by corner, in my name alone. Fully read, fully understood. Nothing signed without my lawyer's eyes on it first. The lease agreement with the first commercial tenant was executed in the spring. I sat in Gerald's office above the hardware store one more time to sign it, properly reading every page, and when it was done, Gerald took off his reading glasses and smiled at me in that restrained, professional way of his. "Your mother would be pleased," he said. I thought about her in that kitchen in the house where I grew up, quiet, organized, planning for futures she'd never see. It's all leaving breadcrumbs that only looked like breadcrumbs until you were in the right place to follow them. "I think she'd be smug about it, actually," I said. Gerald laughed. I didn't think I'd heard him laugh before. It was a good sound. I walk sometimes in the evenings now, nothing dramatic, just through the neighborhood when the light is going gold and the air is still. I think about what it cost to learn what I learned. Not just the money, not just the marriage or the house or the car or the savings account. I mean the internal cost. The period where I genuinely did not know if I was capable of rebuilding something from that little. I think about my mother, planning in quiet rooms for a daughter who didn't know she needed a safety net. I think about what she understood that I didn't, that the most durable things are the things no one knows to take. She didn't leave me a house. She left me land, something older and quieter and more patient than a house. She didn't leave me money in an account someone could drain. And she left me something that required me to show up and claim it, which meant that by the time I held it, I had also earned the understanding of how to hold it. She left me something no one could sign away without my knowledge. And maybe more than the land itself, she left me the lesson inside it. Pay attention. Read everything. Trust, but verify. And when the world strips you down to a cardboard box, check the box. What was in mine, wrapped in a Bible, tucked under a photo album, changed everything. I'm not who I was on that porch. I'm not the woman who signed things she didn't read and called it trust. I'm not waiting for anyone else to build the foundation. The women in my family figured it out. I don't forget that anymore. If you've ever signed something without reading it because you trusted someone, I'm not here to judge you. I did the same thing for years. If you've ever stood somewhere holding the pieces of a life that used to make sense, I want you to know that the next chapter doesn't look like the last one. It can't. You're different now. And sometimes the thing that saves you is something someone who loved you quietly put in place long before you knew you'd need it. Tell me in the comments, what did you almost give up on that turned out to be exactly what you needed to hold on to? I read every comment. I mean that. If this story hit you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs it today. Not for the algorithm, for them. Take care of yourselves out there.